Okay, I'm talking, this is an award for applied research, as you know. So what I want to do today is to open a discussion or encourage discussion about a dilemma that's really faced by all of us who do applied research, and that is how to do unbiased research on controversial social issues. And what I'm really hoping is to raise ideas among you, which you will then send to me, and I'll put them into a paper and take credit for all of them. Okay, so lately, as you all know, there's been widespread concern about bias in psychological research. The replication crisis has publications every month. The criticisms of the use of questionable practices, these are directed at all of psychology, and some say all of medicine, and there are even a few people who say, forget it, it's all of science. But nonetheless, I think the intensity of the debate has become greater in social psychology, and especially in research with implications for social policy. So in 1994, Tetlock wrote an article in which he took political scientists to task for doing research that just fit their own biases, and said that basically the people we want to persuade are not going to see us as scientists at all, but just as political partisans. So that sort of threw down the gauntlet for the beginning. And then last year, many of you are aware of this article by Duarte and his colleagues, Crawford, Stern, Haidt, Jussum, and Tetlock, who accused us all in the Academy of having a pervasive liberal bias and discriminating against the poor, unfortunate conservatives. This shows in our research, as well as in our discriminatory admissions policy. Okay, I will not go into my full reactions to that particular article. But it raises the first question, is the bias worse in applied research? And I've thought about this, and I really don't know. There's reasons why it might be worse for research on social issues, and that is that not only do we have colleagues in psychology who agree with us, but our whole social reference group tends to support our political values. There is evidence that we rarely talk to people who disagree with us. Okay, so everybody we know has the attitudes that we have about affirmative action, about gun control, and so forth. So this encourages what Lee Ross calls naive realism. It just seems like the truth. We also may be more biased because we believe our findings will do good for the world, not just good for science. And finally, this attitude may be a fundamental part of our identity, our left wing or our pro-feminist or whatever issue it is we're involved in. On the other hand, I think being a scientist is also a fundamental part of our identity, and it would be really devastating to most of us to be accused of doing cheating or even unconsciously biased science. So that's what the dilemma is. Now, why might the problem of bias be worse for basic research? First of all, because the issue of bias isn't so salient. They're not nervous about it all the time, worrying that they might be accused of bias. Secondly, because those of us who do policy-related research are aware that we're very likely to be attacked, that there's people waiting out there to go after us. And this is especially true in law. So if you're going to testify in court, you can be sure that people on the other side will have found every idiotic study that disagrees with you, and they'll be there, and they'll put those studies out, and they'll say, well, what do you think about Glockenspiel 1912, who seems to have found the opposite of what you found, Dr. Ellsworth. So you do have to know about Glockenspiel 1912 and have an answer to that question. In basic research, this is less likely to happen. You don't have people who are devoting weeks of their lives to finding ways just to discredit you. Okay, so we have to be prepared to defend. So I do research, as Igor said, both in basic science and in applied research, and I ask myself, which would I mind being discredited more? And I don't think I really know. My intuition is that I'm going to hate it even more if you go after the basic research, but I'm not sure. However, there's also the other answer to that is, so what? It doesn't really make us particularly virtuous if we can point our finger and say, ha, 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 they're bad too. Basic researchers are also bad, so I have nothing to worry about as an applied researcher. The real question is, what do we do about it? The biases are pervasive, largely unconscious. Our field discovered these biases. Ross, Nisbet, Tversky, we ought to be aware of them, can't deny them. And anyone who says, well, I'm not biased, we're not going to take that person's word for it. Okay, so one point of view that's been around forever, since Plato, that's forever in our field, is that it can't be done. You can either be an advocate for policy, like Pericles, or you can be a seeker of truth, like Plato. And if you've ever read Plato, there's no question which is the deeply inferior choice to make, and which is the superior choice to make, and you simply can't do both. Okay, this point of view is actually still expressed today. For example, in some of the responses to that Duarte article about conservatives that I talked about a minute ago, the attitude that you can't do scientifically acceptable research on any topic that involves your values. So you either do two simple choice, give up the values, give up the research. Roy Baumeister actually says that he doesn't vote because voting involves taking sides and will destroy his objectivity. Okay, Plato would have loved him. Few people in this room, I think, are willing to follow that advice. So I put it out there in case you suddenly a light bulb goes, oh, that's all I have to do. Give up my research. Great, I'll do it. No. Many of us got involved in policy research because we thought that we were correcting past biases in research, in basic research. This is really where feminist psychology began, that the basic research on gender seemed to define females entirely in terms of deficiencies. I got turned down for graduate school at Harvard. Stanford, fortunately, had better taste, but Harvard, I actually asked somebody, I said, hey, you know, I actually have super-duper scores and a super-duper record. Who are these 10 people who are so much better than me? And they said, no, we have a study that shows that women lack the stamina to make it to the PhD. Oh, thank you for telling me that. Good. Now I understand. I'll just go to Stanford, where stamina apparently is not required. Okay, so, I mean, the attitude in basic science was that competence in all its variety, scientific competence, leadership competence, is somehow crammed onto this tiny, shriveled up little Y chromosome. And although, and so feminist research began as a response to that. And although I'm the first to admit that some feminist research has been biased, it's no more biased than the basic research that it was responding to. Others of us, including myself, got involved in applied research because we were offended that huge policy decisions were being made by the legal system on the basis of no research at all. Just 9 old men's intuitions about human behavior. So first they decide 6 people, 12 people, doesn't matter how many are in a group, decision-making processes are the same. Then the next year they said, you know, if a group has to be unanimous or not unanimous, that doesn't make any difference to the way group decision-making happens. And so we thought, hey, you don't know that. It's not that we have tons of evidence one way or the other, it's that we have no evidence one way or the other much, and that forever after non-unanimous juries are fine because it makes no difference in how juries work. That was offensive to many of us. And also excluding a whole group because of their race, because of their gender, because of their attitudes. That's not a problem if the 12 people left are 12 people who say they could be fair. It won't make any difference. Okay, so we in psychology and law believe that you shouldn't be making decisions based on human behavior without any information about human behavior. So in both of these cases, it was not only our social values, but also our scientific values that provoked people into the field. Okay, so given that we're not going to give up either ourselves or our research, what can we do? There's 3 areas, I think, where concern about values should come in: the evaluation of research, the conduct of research, and the communication of research. I'll start with the evaluation of research. We all do this. We do this as editors, as reviewers, as readers of our student papers, especially people like me who teach methods. And when we're planning a new line of research, we supposedly review what's already out there in the field, and we begin our introduction with our view of what the field looks like. The usual advice is that what we should do is be aware of these biases. Nisbet's got a new book out. Gilovich and Ross have a new book out. If only we know about these biases, that will protect us against them, and we should be aware of them, and we ought to be aware of them, since I said we invented them. And we should try, but it's probably not enough. That it's so much easier to be aware of other people's biases than it is to be aware of our own. So what I've been doing is thinking about actual practices we could engage in, and I encourage all of you to send me more, as I said. One idea is that you read the method first. Before you know the findings. Read the method and then possibly read the results. Forget about the introduction and discussion. This is not easy to do with the current setup because you get an article with a title, and the title says, "Old people are happier than young people." And you say, well, you sort of know what the author's hypothesis is before you get anywhere, right? So, I mean, if editors might consider, and I gather that one has actually done this, just sending out method and results first, getting the review, and then sending the whole article. Phil Tetlock, Linda Skitka, and others say that a good idea, and this is worth trying, is to imagine that the results came out the opposite from what you wanted them to come out. Now, how does the methodology of the study look to you? You thought it was an excellent study when it reflected your hypothesis, and now imagine that it reflects the enemy. How does the method look? Or you thought the study that supported the opposite point of view was really trashy and ugly, and what do you think of it now that you think it supports your point of view? I've tried this. I'm not really good at this. I mean, the voice in my head says, oh, that would never happen, right? So there are things to, bias is to try to overcome in this. Another thing that's often recommended is talk to people who disagree with you. When I've said this to colleagues, they say, oh, I don't know anybody who disagrees with me, right? And you say, well, that is actually part of the problem, sweetie. You can go, in law it's easy, because there is another side, and if you're going to write a brief on something, somebody's going to write a brief saying the opposite thing. So not at brief writing time, but in between, it's useful to talk to people and say, where did you get those ideas, right? We try to do it in a somewhat nicer way than that. Economics departments often have people who disagree with us. There are whole think tanks that have people who disagree with us. You could send a message. So I'm not entirely persuaded by the argument that it is impossible to find somebody who disagrees with your brilliant ideas, because they actually are out there. Another thing I thought of recently is what Atul Gawande recommended for surgeons. If it works for surgeons, it might work for us. Have a checklist that when you're evaluating an article, you have the same sort of list you have when you're reading a student paper. And it starts with something like sample, big enough, who are they? Independent variable, how did they create the treatment? Does it fit the conceptual variable? Are there protections against experimenter bias? Dependent variable, on and on. And that protects you against the tendency to start reading the article, realize that it confirms your fondest hopes, and then find how really lovely this method was, how innovative. And you might have used the word really stupid instead of innovative if the results had come out the other way. And just do that every time. This one, I think, is easier to implement than a lot of the others. Then you have to be willing to criticize stupid articles that agree with you. Especially in policy research, there will be lots of bad articles that agree with you, because many people are involved in this field who do not have our high-minded, wonderful scientific values, that for them the policy values are much more important. So when we're evaluating the field, we ought to be able to say in the introduction, there are also articles by so-and-so and so-and-so, but I don't think you should consider those, even though they support this point of view, because they're bad. You actually become a lot more trustworthy person if you're willing to admit that even people who agree with you can do quite inferior research. Okay, so that's the evaluation of research, which we do a lot of. Conduct of research follows a lot of the same principles. Now, certainly there's a lot of good methodological evidence out there, and I have hardly any time in this talk to go over it all. You can find it. Your scientist identification should come first. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the things that aren't usually mentioned there. One is, some people say that our biases affect the selection of our research questions, and that's certainly true. Some research, we look ahead, we see it's more likely to give us findings that we like. So I once did a study showing that any individuating personal information that you give about somebody who's committed a murder, like this murderer eats Cheerios for breakfast, right? Whoa, people suddenly get a lot more lenient when they hear that. Now, this is not, I think, diagnostic of murderous tendencies, although I haven't done the research to find out. Okay, so that study I did, and then somebody could easily say, well, Phoebe, if you humanized the victim, you would probably get results that made people less likely to want, more likely to want the death penalty for that person. You just humanized the murderer, so you are biased. And to that I sort of say, it's not my job to do that research. If you think of that great study, you can do it, but in choosing the research I do, I admit that it's likely to be biased, but I don't think it's my job to go around doing their research for them too. I don't think it's realistic to ask people to study different questions from what they want to. There are a few studies that I really think should be avoided. Like, it's a sad truth that many people who do political research want to show that their enemies are deranged, inferior, pathological, wrong, and they do surveys to show, Donald Trump is a good example now of this could not be a normal person. We as psychologists are now going to say this could not be a normal person. I think this is pretty inappropriate. I've worked on the death penalty for many years. During almost all of those years, a majority of Americans have favored the death penalty. No two ways about it. Occasionally, even at times when it's like 75% of Americans favor the death penalty, you get the 25% writing articles saying, these are brain-damaged, authoritarian, pathological, weird people. And you say, no. The 25% does not get to tell the 75% that they are deviant and off of the normal curve. I mean, it's just not persuasive. So I don't like that sort of research. In doing your own research, some of the same things you can use as in evaluating other people's research. A checklist is useful here too. Talking to other people, particularly presenting the research before you have the results, and along with your hypothesis. We do it in our lab groups. If we do it to slightly broader groups, we're more likely to get useful, critical feedback. And if we present it to our opponents, we're likely to get quite a lot. There's one journal, Perspectives in Psychological Science. Bobby, I don't know whether they started this under you or not, but has a special section for publishing articles that are collaborations between me and somebody who totally disagrees with me. So if you can get somebody to do that, there's one with Kahneman who did that. They're really very useful articles. It's worth trying. I have tried and failed to do this. So I say, hey, Paul Ekman, want to write an article with me about emotion? No, I do not. So it's, but if they say no, fine. I mean, you tried. Okay, where am I? Oh, I also really like it when you frame the study as a research question rather than as a yes or no, null hypothesis, real hypothesis, true, false, win, lose proposition. For a long time in the field, I mean, ever since the 19th century, there's been a set of scholars who have suggested designing studies to test multiple alternative hypotheses. So if theory X is right, we'll get this pattern of results. If theory Y is right, this pattern. If theory Z is right, this pattern. And it could even tell us that X is right in some ways and Y is right in other ways. That, I think, is really pretty elegant research. It's not going to fit some of the modern recommendations like register your hypothesis in advance, because you don't exactly have a hypothesis. I have figured out the best way to answer this question, and here's what I'm doing, and I'll believe what I find. Not many articles come like that, partly because we have a strong emphasis on having a hypothesis, but I really love not having a hypothesis. Okay, the final area is the communication of research, and this is a different issue for applied research than for basic research. We have to recognize that research on social issues gets communicated to a much broader audience than basic research. We can assume that our colleagues will be skeptical about our claims in the discussion section, and they'll evaluate them in terms of what they read in the methods section and the results that we actually got. People who are not scientists, legislators, judges, reporters, the public, are more likely to read only the introduction and discussion. They're not ashamed of that. They tell me that, hey, I read your introduction and discussion, and so I think you're so right. And I said, well, you have no way of knowing whether I'm so right, do you, right? So we have to be much, much more careful about overclaiming. That our own colleagues could say, oh, that's a ridiculous overclaiming. I saw that table. That didn't happen. But the public out there, unfortunately, did not see that table or did not look at it. There's lots and lots of pressure to overclaim in our field from everybody, from lawyers. You testify in court, and the lawyer whose side you're testifying on really wants you to leave out every tiny thing that might contradict your basic message. So ages ago, I did a study trying to show that the people who were not allowed to sit on death penalty cases had more values that favored the prosecution, that favored the defense, than the people who were allowed to sit. So I had a nice 11-item scale, and I got big, nice, significant differences on 9 of the items. So I'm going to testify in court. I'm feeling pretty good about this. And the lawyer says, okay, so we'll bury the other 2 items, right? This was the first time I just heard the word bury in relation to data. And so I just go in and I say, I did this test of 9 items, and they all came out significant. So that was a serious suggestion, and I said, I'm not going to do that. You know, any scientist would think you were lying if you got 9 out of 9. Okay, so the reporters want your research to be earth-shaking. They want to hook their reader by saying, science will never be the same again after this amazing finding, this astonishing scientific breakthrough that Ellsworth has had. And so you want to dampen down that. And I will say our own NSF is not helping. I don't know who has applied for a grant recently or reviewed a grant, but for every single grant you have to say why it's transformative. Every single piece of research that somebody does in America that's fundable has to transform the field. I don't think so, and I feel like an idiot when I'm writing these reviews and say this is going to transform the field in the following teeny-weeny way that, right, it's... But you don't. You like the proposal, so you have to sort of lie. It's important, not on your grant proposals, but to resist this when you're presenting in court, when you're talking to lawyers, overclaiming is not only dishonest, but it plays right into the hands of the people who want to discredit you. They will pick out the thing that you've said that's least accurate, or they will pick out the important counter evidence that you failed to mention at all when they interviewed you, and say, you can't trust a thing she says. Look, she shoved under the rug the fact that 50% of her subjects quit halfway through the experiment, or whatever. So what you want to do is say, here's what I did, here's what I found, here's how I interpret it, and here are the questions that are not yet answered yet that should be next on the agenda. Reporters kind of like unanswered questions. This is a good way sometimes to distract them from the fact that you haven't actually changed American civilization as we know it. Okay, then another important thing is to remember that all the evidence, most of social issues involve a bunch of different areas of research, and the evidence on all of these is not equally strong. So you don't have to defend all of it. I mean, this is related to people who agree with you doing bad studies. So on the death penalty, I can say, yes, innocent people have been sentenced to death, no doubt about it. I can say it's applied in an arbitrary way, that you can find people who've done just as bad or worse crimes who were not sentenced to death as the ones who were sentenced to death. I can say you're much more likely to get the death penalty if you kill a white person than if you kill a black person. I cannot say with the same confidence, if you are a black person, you're much more likely to get the death penalty. The data look that way, but if you control for everything else, you end up not being able to tell whether it's race or one of these other factors. So race of victim, yes. Then you have people who actually argue that having a death penalty causes more murders than it prevents. There are studies that show this, but I think the evidence is quite weak on those. So when people interview me, I want to be able to say, here's what I can really say, here's where I don't think we really know yet, and here's where I think this is probably going to end up being wrong. People who agree with you on the policy issue who are not scientists are often sort of unhappy that you say, well, you know, I can't really say about the race of the killer. It looks like an important factor, but the data don't really support it. And I say, Phoebe, you're letting down the side. And I'm saying, well, you know, there are sides and sides. And if I'm going to be a useful expert for you, I've got to be a credible scientist forever. One of the lawyers I first worked with, Anthony Amsterdam, I said, okay, so I've got a year and a half of law courses. Should I get a law degree? He says, no. We really want you to keep your credibility. Okay, so you want to be able to rank order the research in terms of where you think the data are really strong, so-so, and really weak. Finally, you have to realize that science is not the whole story when it comes to policy. Values matter too. And we can answer fact questions, and we should answer fact questions, and they should listen to us. But that doesn't always answer the policy question. So I can say, look, you create a jury that's more diverse, that has more diverse points of view. It's going to deliberate longer. It's going to raise more issues. The discussion is going to be, on the whole, deeper and smarter than if you have a completely homogeneous jury. But the government could decide, well, we'd rather have the jury not deliberate so long. Our value is shorter deliberation, so we'll admit that diversity is going to make for a more careful decision, but we'd rather save the time. Okay, and so the policy question is not 100% determined by science, and our own values, we don't have to say that science is the only reason we have our values. So I can favor diversity because I think it's better for a lot of kind of decision-making, like jury decision-making, but I don't have to believe that it's better for Math 101. I can say, look, I also believe in diversity because it's fair, and that's not even a scientific question, but that's part of the reason for my belief. Okay, last thing, the bigger picture. So far, everything I've talked about and recommended will help us to be better people, will assuage our consciences, so I can walk around and think, ha, 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 I am so moral compared to you. But these individual effects may not be enough to get accurate information to the public. You know, the news agency calls, I don't pick up, they call somebody else, right? So it's really haphazard whose views actually get out there. I think that what we need, if we want the public to have accurate information on an issue, is some sort of collective, trusted, accurate information resource on issues that we know about that will include all the relevant facts, a place where reporters can go, students can go, legislators can go, knowing that they will get accurate information, judges, the public. There are a couple of examples. If you go to the site called Climate Change, that is a group of journalists and scientists who got together, say, the discussion on climate change is such a mess. How's the public to know what to believe? And I've tried to make this a repository of correct information. On a much smaller scale, one I've been involved in for a long time is the Death Penalty Information Center. If you go there, you find what's the law on the death penalty, what are the data on race, innocence, public opinion, and then, of course, this has to keep changing. When this started, we never thought we'd have to know about lethal injection drugs, but now they're on the site, too. And this is where, if you ever read an article about the death penalty, you will see the Death Penalty Information Center cited. It's the place that everybody believes has the information. We could do this for a lot more issues, not us so much as individuals, but the APS could do that. And Galisteo said in his initial speech that the APS was getting more involved in policy research, and I hope this is a direction they go in. It's not as big a deal as you might think. The Death Penalty Information Center has been around for 25 years. It's 3 people. And a board of directors, we meet once, 3 times a year or so forth. But the people who actually do it, collect the data day by day, is a small group, and we could do that for lots of other issues. Okay, so, and I think this is a way that we could give back rather more effectively than even by individually being ethically pure. Okay, I want to thank everybody who gave me this award. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank all the students. No, I want to thank most of the students I've ever had, and all of you. And if they have any questions or comments, fine. Thank you.